Filing in, I just want to welcome everyone to Herd and Rye. I'm Jennifer Reisner, and I co-chair the Herd and Rye Committee with Tina Steinberg. We're so pleased you could tune in for tonight's talk on strategies to combat sleep issues in childhood and adolescence, given by Dr. Shelby Harris, who I will introduce in just a moment. For those of you who don't know, Herd and Rye is a committee comprised of representatives from various organizations in Rye, as well as public and independent schools. We work to provide lectures throughout the year to educate our community on various aspects of parenting. This year, we will have covered such topics as learning differences, ways to support our kids through virtual learning, the impact of social media, race and raising racially aware children. And tonight, we will be talking about children's sleep issues. Just a heads up, our final talk for the year will be held on April 15th, and we're fortunate to have Julie Lithcott-Haynes doing a kind of a double header. She'll be educating us first on how to raise an adult based on her award-winning book, and that will be a talk that's being held at from 12 to 1:30, and then she'll continue at our usual time, which is 7 p.m., same day, with her new book, doing a talk on her new book called It's Your Turn, How to Actually Be an Adult. And again, that's April 15th. So right now I'd like to take the time to introduce this evening's very accomplished speaker. Dr. Harris is in private practice in White Plains, where she is board certified in behavioral sleep medicine and treats a wide variety of sleep disorders using evidence-based non-pharmacological treatments. Before going into private practice, Dr. Harris was the longstanding director of the Behavioral Sleep Medicine Program at the Sleep-Wake Disorders Center at Montefiore Medical Center. She's the author of many published papers from her extensive research on the subject and has written for the New York Times, Dr. Oz's website, and Psychology Today, as well as being frequently quoted and interviewed both in print and on TV. So we are in for a real treat here with a lot of information, no doubt. Before she starts, I'd like to bring your attention to the QA button at the bottom of your screens, and please feel free to send us your questions. Please use that tab and not the chat tab, because we'll be drawing from that for our questions for Dr. Harris, and she'll look to answer those following her talk. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Shelby Harris, and I'm going to black myself out so you don't see me.
Sounds good. All right, let me share my screen. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming tonight. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me just get my screen shared. 1 second. Slideshow. Play from start. All right. So I was asked to come and talk about sleep in kids and adolescents. And I think the pandemic on top of it has definitely added an interesting layer as well. And I'll talk a little bit about that. But it's one of those things where sometimes we get so focused on children's sleep schedules, children's routines, that then the pandemic kind of just threw everything out the window for a lot of times. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the stuff that the pandemic has addressed, but I'm also going to talk about just basic sleep practices and also when you should really think about seeing someone or talking to your pediatrician for a referral for a sleep specialist, because there are some things that really should be treated or addressed as well. So here's my information here. I have a private practice in White Plains, although full disclosure, everything is pretty much remote right now. It's working actually really well for many of my patients. And I have a website, so if you have questions, if you want to contact me, you can go through that website, drshelbyharris.com. There's a submit questions there. And I also have an Instagram account, @sleep.shelby, where I put out some information as well and collaborate with some other people for just sleep information. So this is Sleep Awareness Month too, so it's always good to be talking about it more and more if possible. So who needs sleep? We all do. But by the age of 18 years, about 40% of a child's time has actually ideally been spent sleeping. And 25 to 40% of kids have sleep problems at some point in childhood. So sleep problems are actually pretty common in childhood. But the problem is that sometimes kids don't outgrow it. So if you don't address it in childhood, oftentimes it just kind of morphs into a different issue. Up to about 80% of children with chronic illnesses or developmental disorders have sleep problems. And why does sleep matter? Why do we make such a big deal out of it? It's interesting. The way we think about sleep is when we think about it, it's hard to come up with a nice, concise sentence as to why do I need sleep other than it's really good for you, it's healthy. It's weird, but the way we often talk about it is what happens to you when you don't sleep. So what are some of the consequences of insufficient sleep? So when we think about it in kids, the first thing that often comes to mind is school performance. We do find, and this has been studied extensively over the years, is that grades do decrease when kids are not getting routinely enough sleep. Tiredness, fatigue, sleepiness. Um, and I have slides on it later, but just so you know, sleepiness in a kid doesn't really look always like sleepiness. So, sleepiness, a sleepy child who's not getting enough sleep often looks hyperactive. So, that's something you should really keep in mind if you have a child who's not sleeping enough, is hyperactive, you're evaluating for any attention deficit issues. It doesn't mean that that isn't an issue, but sometimes things like sleep apnea, sleep deprivation get missed, and we often go the ADHD route. But sleepiness can often make kids just look very hyperactive. Mood changes, so we see more anxiety, more depression in kids who aren't sleeping, irritability, like I had here. Sleepy kids don't always look sleepy. A lot of noncompliance and aggression can happen in those kids too. There's issues just like with adults, right? Problems with memory. I know when I don't sleep well, I can't remember things easily. My attention's not there. Problem solving, learning, all those things are a big issue. And then also when we think about it medically, there's weight gain is a big problem. When kids aren't sleeping enough, you don't metabolize your food the same way. You have metabolic issues. There's often, even in adults, when you're not sleeping enough, you have more of the signal in your brain that says, or the hormone that's ghrelin that says go, which means eat more, eat more. And then you have less of the one that says stop eating, which is leptin. And so you don't have the same satiety signals, and instead your brain's always saying eat, eat, eat. And then what do we tend to go for when we're not sleeping enough? We tend to go for high fat, high sugar foods to give us that boom of energy. And so oftentimes there's weight gain, and we see that in kids a lot. Family issues, so it causes a lot of irritability within the family, a lot of just family strife in general. In adolescents, especially, and this has been studied a lot too, is that there's when adolescents are sleep deprived, they have more risky behaviors. They engage in more risky behaviors. So more just unprotected sex. There's a lot more drinking, drug use, just risky behavior in general. But it's definitely something that needs to be addressed. So I got one of these questions in advance forwarded to me, but how do you know if your kid's getting enough sleep? And I have slides later about like general sleep guidelines for kids. But how do you know that your kid needs more sleep? So the first sign is that you have to awaken them. And what I mean by awaken them is you have to go in there and be like, it's time to get up, like shake them or just like kind of like pull the covers off. Really have to really put a lot of effort into waking your child up. Then sleeps more 2 or more hours on the weekends or vacations than they do on the weekdays. So essentially they're compensating for sleep a lot more on the weekends than they normally would. Other things that can happen, but don't always, is that they're falling asleep at inappropriate times, or they're falling asleep in school, which is not the ideal time either. A lot of times these kids will, especially younger ones, will fall asleep in the car ride home, but that's a sign that they might need more sleep. And then finally, behavior or mood changes when they have nights of more sleep. So if it's like that weekend and you notice their mood's a lot better because they got a lot more sleep versus the days when they're not getting enough, that can be a sign too that sleep is the regulating factor for mood a lot of times. How do you know that you've got the right amount of sleep though? So falling asleep, the idea is a lot of people have this ideal that when you fall asleep, it should be boom, you're passed right out. Not really the case. The minute you hit the pillow, if your head is asleep immediately, sometimes it's a sign that you need a little bit more sleep or that the quality of the sleep you're getting is not great. So it should take a few minutes to fall asleep. And even within 15 to 30 minutes is within normal limits. So some people get I even work with some kids who get so worried that they don't fall asleep within 5-10 minutes. That's okay. Okay. 10 to 15 minutes, even up to 30 for some, as long as you're not awake a lot in the middle of the night, it's within normal limits. That's all right. Then the other key is that they sleep through the night. So one thing to note is that everyone wakes up throughout the night. We all do. 5 to 7-ish times. You go through these cycles of deep, light sleep, REM sleep, and then after each cycle, you have a quick awakening. And most people, that awakening is so quick, you have amnesia for it. You go right back to sleep. Now, if they sleep through the night and they can settle themselves back to sleep and they're not up for a long time, great, that's fine. And then they wake, this is the key, they wake by themselves in the morning with maybe a little help. Like sometimes I have to go in and say to my son, hey, you got to get up a little bit, like kind of like nudge him a little bit, but I don't have to, it's not like a fight constantly. And that the other key is that they don't sleep in, try to compensate for multiple hours on the weekends or weekdays, like days off from school. So, what about sleep across the ages? So, I get this a lot of like, how much sleep should my child be getting? Now, I love this graph. It's a little bit older, or this chart. It's a little bit older at this point, but it still has all the age appropriate ranges in it. The reason I love it is because it really clearly shows you that there is a range, right? So with this range, and then you use those guidelines of are they getting enough sleep that I had said a little while ago. This should help you determine whether your child's getting enough. So if we think about preschool to maybe the teen years, preschoolers and school age, preschoolers 10 to 13 hours. And remember, there's also some naps in some of these kids between at age 3. Hefty portions start to really drop their nap, and I'll talk about that a little bit. But then when they start to become school age, about 9 to 11 is the average amount of sleep that you want to aim for with your child. But then if you see 7 to 8 or 12 in those teal boxes, that suggests that there are some outliers who do okay with just a little less, and some that do actually need more sleep. But the vast majority of kids need between 9 and 11 hours a night. And then when you become a teen, 8 to 10 hours is the range. But then again, there's that little bit of outlier of 7 or 11 hours. And so on. This chart always makes me laugh because older adults at 65 plus has a cane. It's like assumed. It's ridiculous to me. But it's a good one to go by. So preschoolers, let's just talk a little bit about that. I know we're talking about a little bit older age range, but I know some of you have preschoolers at home, so I figured I'd address it. Sleep patterns, total sleep time for preschoolers, about 11 to 12 hours. Now with the napping, I get this a lot too, is when should my child drop their nap? By 3 years, about 90% are starting to have dropped their nap, or 92% of kids are napping at 3 years. Sorry, 27% are napping at 5 years. So a lot of them really start to drop them at between 3 and 4 years old. That's kind of the most common age range. And then once you hit 5, there's a very small percentage of kids that actually still do need that nap. My kids stopped napping about 3.5. My son at 3.5, my daughter just at 3. So sometimes you have to be careful. Some people try to take away the nap too fast. So that should be the last thing you want to have go. If you take away the nap too early, sometimes that can actually worsen your sleep at night. If you're overtired, that can actually make sleep at night worse for a child sometimes. So you really have to be careful before you just overall abandon the nap and talk to your pediatrician about it. So sleep practices with this age range especially, and I think for all age ranges, routine is essential. And imagination is really important to really address here. So that a lot of these kids start having fears, bedtime resistance, monsters, all that stuff. They're really going to test your limits with whether to go to bed or not. And what we see is a lot of these kids, this is a peak range or peak age range for like the I can't go to bed, one more glass of water, one more of this, one more of that. And we also see a lot more at around 4 to 5 years old, we see a lot more parasomnias. So what are those? Parasomnias are nightmares, night terrors. So a nightmare, just so you know if you're trying to figure this out with your kid, nightmare is when they typically happen last third of the night. And a nightmare is typically where there's dream content that's scary or upsetting, and the person who has it is more upset by it. So they remember it. They wake up from it and remember a piece of it or the whole thing. Now, a night terror is usually the first third of the night, and that's kind of almost like a sleepwalking disorder in a weird way. The child wakes up. Sometimes we'll just have the most common ones like a blood curdling scream. It's like, ah! And then they go right back down to sleep. And in the morning, the person who had the night terror has no recollection or very little recollection, but the person who observed it was much more disturbed by it. So if you can figure out who's more disturbed by it, the parent or the child, that might tell you whether it's a night terror or a nightmare. And those are different treatments that you would do overall. And then the other thing that's peak in this range, this age range, is obstructive sleep apnea. So we see a lot of 4 to 5 year olds have snoring, and any child who's snoring should get evaluated because snoring in a child is not normal, especially if it's constant snoring. If they have allergies or a cold and it's here and there, that's okay. But if it's consistent snoring, that should get evaluated. And the reason it's actually quite high in this age group is because their airway doesn't grow as fast as their tonsils and adenoids grow. So their tonsils and adenoids grow faster, the airway is still narrow, and then there's crowding, and that leads to the snoring. So one of the treatments that is often done is having a tonsillectomy and adenoidectomy. So if we do those things, it will hopefully help with the snoring, hopefully help your child have more restful sleep at night. So just monitor that in any of your younger kids. School age. So you see the child down there sleeping, as I said. Falling asleep at inappropriate times is a big thing. So total sleep time, about 10, maybe even 9 to 11 hours, depending upon the child, but usually 10 to 11. Naps should be unusual in this age range, especially the 7, 8, 9, 10 ages. Really unusual. So if they're falling asleep like that on a set of books or in the car every day, that should be the sign that there's something going on that needs to be addressed. Whether it's this quality of sleep they're getting at night, maybe it's they're having apnea or something else is going on, or they're just not getting enough sleep. So what are some other things that start to happen? We start to see changes in sleep schedule. So in these kids, they start to become we have some that are like still wake up really early and go to bed early, but then over time, as you get closer to that 11, 12-year-old range, they start to want to naturally go to bed a little bit later. And I'm going to talk about that a lot more in depth soon. So they start to go to bed later and want to wake up later. And those are the ones that, he's 11 tomorrow, actually. I have an 11-year-old who I still have to kind of nudge out of bed a bit, but it's not horrible, but I just see it starting to drift later. And that's totally within normal limits. And there's also less parental awareness of what's going on at night, right? So we're not necessarily next to our 10-year-old all night long, asking them how long it took them to fall asleep. So you really do need to ask them questions about what their sleep's like, what it's like in the middle of the night, if you're just not sure and you think something might be going on. Other things that we see that can lead to sleep problems, anxiety. And I think with the pandemic, it's just through the roof right now. So that definitely can be that can definitely be influencing things. So adolescents. So this is another big age range that I get a lot of referrals for because it's a big struggle. So in sleep patterns in adolescence, and this is where most people laugh, is that adolescents on average, remember that age range I give you, or that sleep range? It's about nine and a quarter hours of sleep. That's where most fall, around nine and a quarter. But the vast majority get 7 or less. And then they're oversleeping way more than 2 hours on weekends, right? Now, things that they're doing to try and compensate, a lot of caffeine, energy drinks. And then they're also there's a lot of tech in the bedroom. They're not sleepy. They're just on their phones, they're on their computers. There's a lot more stimulation going on. And there's a few things that are happening. So one is, like I said, it's normal as you get older to want to go to bed later. That's physically, biologically. This work was done many years ago by Mary Carskadden at Brown, where she demonstrated that adolescents have a natural shift to go to bed later and sleep later, and that it does not match with school start times. And that as a result, it causes a lot of cumulative sleep debt. Now, the pandemic has definitely alleviated some of that for some, like I have here. So with a lot of the teenagers, ones that I'd been treating for a while, they didn't have to get up, especially when school went virtual at the beginning. They didn't have to get up anymore at 6 in the morning and not fall asleep until 1 in the morning. So they didn't have school until 8 or 9. So they were able to get a little bit more sleep. So it actually is better for some people because they don't have that really crazy early school start time. But for others, the sleep issues have definitely worsened. There's a lot more anxiety and fear and trouble sleeping. A lot of people are worried about just whether, I mean, I have kids that are just worried, am I going to have school tomorrow? Am I not going to have school tomorrow? I don't know what it's going to look like. I can't sleep. And they just start getting much more worried about that. The other thing that we're seeing a lot of is just increased separation anxiety. Kids, especially ones who haven't been in person in school as much, it's jarring to go back to school or go back out of the house alone and separate from the parent, that it can be more problematic at night. And the other big thing we're seeing is that they're on their screens all day. So a lot of times with virtual school, they're just staring at a screen, and then the homework is staring at a screen, and there's just no physical activity either, right? So very sedentary. And I know as adults, we're all suffering from this as well. So what are some common pediatric sleep disorders that you really need to keep an eye out for when you might want to refer or talk to your doctor for maybe a referral to see a pediatric sleep specialist or contact someone like myself? First thing, like I said, obstructive sleep apnea. So we see it a lot in kids, in younger kids, because of that tonsillectomy or the tonsil issue with their crowded airway. Um, but also we see it a lot we've seen it more and more in adolescents and even younger kids with obesity. And as the obesity rates are rising and there's not as much exercise and kids are gaining weight, especially during the pandemic, if they start snoring more, that can lead to apnea, meaning that they're just like having essentially obstructions in their breathing throughout the night. And then they wake up really fast, go back to sleep, wake up, and it happens multiple times an hour, but they have no idea it's happening usually. Same thing in adults. But it's something that should be treated, can be treated, and needs to be evaluated, especially if you notice you have a sleepy kid during the day. So, parasomnias. So, sleepwalking, like I said, sleepwalking, night terrors, any of those sorts of issues. So, if it's often very normal. I was a sleepwalker as a child. My children are sleepwalkers as well. It's very hereditary. So if it's not causing a problem, you don't necessarily have to get it evaluated in kids. It's normal. I would mention it to your doctor. But one of the things that can definitely worsen this issue, sleep terror, sleepwalking, nightmares, is sleep deprivation. So if your child has an irregular sleep pattern and they're having a lot of sleepwalking or they're waking up with night terrors, get them on a better schedule, get them enough sleep, make sure that caffeine's not an issue, all the things I'm going to talk about in a minute. That can definitely help. If that's not enough, then you might want to talk to a doctor about it. Sometimes the sleepwalking night terrors can really be scary to the parents because you're worried your child's going to walk around the house. So think about safety as well. We have, for my children, we always had a gate at the top of the stairs for a long time. And just try to make the environment, the things that they're not walking into if they do get up. And the other thing is, don't wake up the person who's in the middle of a sleepwalking episode. Just gently guide them back to bed. It's bedtime. Gently get. If you try to like get them involved in a whole conversation or whatever it might be that you're trying to do in the middle of the night, that can sometimes prolong the event. So gentle, guide back to bed, done. If it's disrupting your family, if it's disrupting someone else in the room, then you might want to talk to your doctor about it. Or if there's a new onset and they're a little bit older, not in this younger like 3 to 5 to 7 kind of age range, then you might want to talk to your doctor as well. RLS PLMD, so this is restless legs or kicking periodically throughout the night. So some kids, they don't know how to describe it, but they have trouble going to bed at night because their arms are like all like kind of, they feel like I had restless legs myself when I was pregnant. It feels like you have like, you can't get calm. It's restless basically, but everyone describes it differently. A lot of my kids that I've worked with have said they feel like they have bugs like crawling up their legs. And it's just this kind of feeling of having to constantly stretch or move around because you just can't settle down to go to sleep, settle your body down. So it's something to look at. It can be treated very well in kids. It does happen in kids. People don't usually think it does, but sometimes they don't have the language to describe it. And it has a circadian pattern. So it gets worse as the night comes. So it's nothing that's really such an issue during the day, but once bedtime comes, I can't, my legs don't want to stay still, that sort of stuff. Talk to your doctor about it. Insomnia, which I'll talk a little bit about, and nightmares. Nightmares super common, and I have a slide on how to really manage that. Oh, and finally, narcolepsy is less common, but it's excessive sleepiness in children, and there can be many other symptoms that go along with it, but that is definitely, if you're trying to get them enough sleep, apnea is not an issue, but they're falling asleep all the time and really struggling, definitely have them evaluated for that. So sleep success for kids. Let's talk about some basic sleep hygiene stuff, and then I'll tailor it a little bit to different age ranges. So consistency. I say it a gazillion times a day to my patients, and they probably are sick of hearing it. But that's what works. Our bodies have a circadian rhythm, 24 hours a day. It's a rhythm that's built into us, and it's a clock. So it's when you go to bed, your body learns this is when melatonin comes out in my brain, and this is when I wake up. And you have to do it with an age-appropriate bedtime. So that amount of time that we were talking about earlier of how much time they should be sleeping at night, try to count back and think what an appropriate bedtime for their wake time would be 7 days a week. It's hard if you have a child who's struggling with getting enough sleep or getting good quality sleep, even as adults. Our bodies don't really have a way to be like, this is the weekday circadian clock and this is the weekend circadian clock. We don't have that ability to switch back and forth as easily. Kids and adults too, but kids especially need that consistency and that routine to help them get better quality sleep throughout the night. So an appropriate bedtime and then a daytime schedule as well. So wake time is really important. And if you have a younger kid, really try to keep those naps as best you can on as good a schedule as you can. It gets harder with every child you have. I had one of my old supervisors, Jody Mindell, who has a great book that she wrote for kids, for baby sleep. But she said to me um, once you have your second, if you have one kid and you have a second kid, aim for your second one to try to nap at home 75% of the time. Or no, with the first kid, it's 75% of the time, aim for your nap. When you have your second one, aim for the naps at home 50% of the time. It gets harder, obviously, when you have more kids. So if you have one that's trying to nap, don't feel like you're being shamed because your child's not napping at home, but just try to, as best you can, keep the schedule routine, even if they can't nap all the time at home. So, a relaxing bedtime routine. So, what does a relaxing bedtime routine look like? And this is something I talk about with all ages, all the time. You want to have routine that helps move ideally toward your bed as the night gets closer so that your brain knows, okay, I'm getting closer to bed. And when we say routine, the reason being is that we're behavioral animals. We respond to behavioral training, believe it or not. So every time you do something, your body now starts to realize, oh, I'm getting closer to my bedtime as you do this on a routine basis. So with kids, I try to keep it short and simple, right? So 3 to 4 activities, same every night. 3 to 4. You don't want any of this ideally like 2 hour business. So it takes all these hours to get them wound down. The ideal bedtime routine should be short and sweet, 3 to 4 activities, and the same every night. And then also without screens. We'll talk about screens in a little bit, but without screens. And I love when kids read at bedtime. It's a good thing for them to do. It's a good way to quiet their brains down, relax, um, and just decompress. And some older kids don't necessarily always want to read at bedtime. I have a lot of young teens who are doing a lot of drawing. They'll draw comics. They'll do a lot of art at bedtime. So I encourage that as well. And then finally, you want to make sure your bedroom is cool, dark, and comfortable. So I always say make it like a cave, but a cave you want to be in. So cool. Temperature varies for people. Upper 60s is usually the ideal. But some people like it a little cooler, a little warmer. Over 72 degrees starts to get a little bit too warm. You actually want it cool throughout the night. Your body does better with that. Comfortable, so make sure it is comfortable. And then technology free. That's the key. That is the hardest one for most parents, especially of adolescents. And there's a point where I encourage people to have, if you're really struggling with your teen or anybody not having their tech in their bedroom, you have to set and model it for your kids, because you could tell them one thing, but then if you're in bed all night on your phone, they're going to see that you don't practice what you preach. So I'm a huge fan of have a charging station outside. When everyone goes to bed, you put everything in the charging station, and that's it. Done. Practice good habits to your kids, and they will hopefully pick it up. A lot of us will practice good eating, exercise, try to model that to our kids, but something like not having your tech in the bed, we're addicted ourselves. So it's really important to have that charging station outside and set those limits. That's where the parenting part comes in. They're not going to like it at first, but you got to do it. Electronics in the bedroom. The study showed that it's pretty clear. I mean, when you have tech in the bedroom, it's a distraction. And when it's on, the kids who use tech in the bedroom or had it in their tech in their bedroom, they get a lot less sleep than those who actually didn't have any tech in their bedroom. So it's important to really get rid of it. So 72% of youth, at least one device in the bedroom. I think that's actually more now, especially after the pandemic. And 97% of 15 to 17-year-olds, that's not surprising, but I think it's even more now for the younger populations. And this is probably happening more and more too, because they're connecting through text. And I think that's gotten, in a good way, it helped connect during the pandemic, but at night it's made things worse. So a lot are awakened regularly by cell phone and text. I have some teenagers and adults who engage in sleepwalking behavior without realizing it. They're texting in the middle of the night because it's so regular to them. Sleepwalking is often routine behaviors that we engage in. So they're doing things that they routinely do when they're asleep because the phone's right there and they have no recollection in the morning. We see that a lot on certain sleep meds too. Sleepwalking behavior with texting, because that's what they all do all the time. Keep it out of the bedroom. So no TV in the bedroom. And why? So our brains naturally make melatonin. So what is melatonin? Melatonin in the field, we call it the hormone of darkness. So essentially what that means is that when the sun goes down, our brains start to have melatonin come out naturally from the pineal gland. So our brain makes melatonin naturally. It should happen that way. Now, in teenagers, as they start to have that later phase delay where they start going to bed later and sleeping later, guess what? Their melatonin starts coming out later, and that's totally normal. But what does melatonin not like? We call it the hormone of darkness, right? It doesn't like light, and it really doesn't like blue light. So we try to really get rid of all electronics. And then people will often say, well, what about the blue light blocking glasses or night shift on my phone? There's mixed data for all that stuff. Sometimes I'm of the like tiered approach. Try to get rid of everything. If that's too hard at first, I have a lot of people who, for some reason, all of a sudden want to watch either Friends or Office before bed. I don't understand, but they love it. It's a big theme right now. So I often will have them, okay, let's start with some blue blocking glasses. It's not ideal, but let's just start with that before bed and then slowly kind of taper yourself off of needing the electronics if that's really, if that can, because that's the goal. Because if you're using them, what it can often do is delay sleep onset by an hour or more, and it can cause awakenings throughout the night in some people because your melatonin is just being essentially your brain's looking at the sun. And why would you get sleepy if you're staring at the sun? You're not going to. Caffeine, that's the other big thing that we see a lot, especially in adolescents. This one, I saw the stats, 27% of preschoolers are using caffeine and get a lot less sleep. I mean, that's a lot, but I don't think it's as common nowadays, or I mean, as common all the time. But a lot of school-age kids are using caffeine, whether it be soda, whether it be coffee, or like the frappuccinos, all that sort of stuff. They're having varying amounts, but as you can see, as they get older, they're consuming more, and it does negatively affect time to fall asleep and also the quality of the sleep. So it's not just, oh, my kid falls asleep okay on caffeine. They're not getting the best quality. And then 85% of adolescents are using caffeine every day. So a lot. It's interesting to see, like I said, during the pandemic, a lot of teens' sleep has gotten better. Not all, but it's gotten somewhat better because of school start times either being later or shortened school days. But I think there's still a lot of demands on them, a lot of work, and a lot are using caffeine. So cut it out, cut the caffeine out. There's all these different things. And some of these are just more sugar drinks and energy drinks more so than caffeine, but not great. So other things that are caffeinated, I mean, there's some of these products are a little older now, but there's so many things that have caffeine in it. Even things like Excedrin, there are certain pills and medications that can have caffeine in it. So you want to watch out or just make sure that it's not got that in it. Another thing that's important is you want to change the cues. So bright light in the morning, and you want to limit light exposure later in the day. So dim the lights. I always say sleep is a dimmer switch. So about an hour before bed, you want to dim the lights, do the reading, the relaxing stuff. That's what that routine's all about. And then in the morning, that's when you open the shades, you get light, and it's alerting to stop the melatonin production to wake you up. It's really important. So one of the other big sleep stealers, pandemic has eased it for some, it's overscheduling. So it's a really it's something that's really important to think about. And is your kid doing too much that it's impairing their ability to sleep at night, or they're going, and then when they want to go to sleep, they're so riled up from everything. A lot of times, like sports can go so late, it's hard to wind yourself down, right? So think about this. Are they eating too late? Are they going out too late? Are they overscheduled? And is that part of the problem? I know it's a very controversial topic to think about, but are we just taking on too much? And as adults, we do the same thing. So what about insomnia? We'll talk a little bit about that. So what is insomnia? So insomnia is essentially difficulty falling asleep or difficulty staying asleep. There can be a bunch of different reasons. Sometimes there's no reason at all. We just don't know why. But sometimes it's, especially in the younger kids, it can be trouble falling asleep alone. But something to note, though, is if some kids, they have this problem, is like I was saying earlier, they have the problem when they were younger, they don't always outgrow it. So I sometimes will see 12, 13, 14-year-olds that still need a parent to come in the middle of the night once in a while to go back to sleep because it just never really resolved from being a kid or being a younger child. Anxiety is another big factor that can factor into insomnia issues. That restless leg I was talking about, that kind of like not being able to move, like settle down your legs or your arms. The name is a misnomer. And then nighttime fears, especially in younger groups, right? So, is there anyone in the house? Are there monsters? I need to have a parent on the same floor, all that sort of stuff. So, falling asleep independently, like I said earlier, night wakings are normal. Bedtime sleep associations you have to think about. So, do you always have to have the parent there? Can you switch the parent? Can the child fall asleep alone? That's always the goal, is to have the child fall asleep alone without the parent right there. Because if they can fall asleep independently at the beginning of the night, eventually they will be able to fall asleep on their own as time goes on. So, what are some other tricks you can try, especially in the slightly older age range, 5, 6, 7, 8 year olds? Bedtime pass, one of my favorite techniques. Is essentially you give them a pass, and they can draw a piece of paper. I had a boy that just did one that was just adorable. He like drew all of his favorite things on it, and you can just have them give them the pass, and you say to them, say to your child, "Here's the pass, and I'm going to keep it next to your bed. You decorate it however you want and write bedtime pass on it. And then when they go to bed, they have the choice. They can use the pass at one point at night if they're coming to get you. So that's their choice to come and get you. So they give you the pass, you take it. That's it. You help them, you do whatever you need that they need in the night. Fine. Then you go back to bed. Then they wake up in the morning and the pass isn't there anymore. Or child can go to bed, have the pass next to them, might wake up in the middle of the night, but looks at the pass and says, I don't want to use it tonight. I don't want to give it to my parent. I'll go back to sleep on my own. So they chose not to trade in the pass. So if they wake up with the pass next to them in the morning, guess what? They traded in for a prize right immediately. So that immediate recognition of I have a prize or I have a pass right here, and if I don't give it in, I'll get a small prize in the morning. That can be very motivating for some kids to help them learn to sleep independently. Good morning light's another big one. So if you have kids that are waking up too early, that light that a lot of people will buy now, fancy ones that just go red and then green at a certain time to turn on in the morning, so they know when it's time to actually start. They can go get your parent, go get the parent. That's a good one to do. And also set it a little earlier. If your child's normally waking at 5, and you don't want them to come out until like 6:30, don't keep setting the alarm for 6:30 because it's very hard to ask a child to wait an hour and a half. Start with maybe 5:15. If they can wait until the 5:15, then move it to 5:30, then 5:45. So you slowly lengthen the amount of time over time. Then finally, the sleep fairy. So if they sleep throughout the night in their bed, guess what? Like the tooth fairy, someone will come and put something under the pillow. So you'd go late at night to leave something. So there are a lot of different ways to help with the independent falling asleep that you should think about. Here's a few of them. I don't have time to go into all of it in detail, but you can slowly, we call it camping out. So you can look at camping out online if you want. That's like you're in the room and then you slowly move your presence away over time if you have a school-age child who's struggling with it. And I always tend to start with just the bedtime. Hopefully after a few weeks, if they can fall asleep better at bedtime, it starts to generalize to the middle of the night. And then in some kids, if they really have a lot of trouble falling asleep at the beginning of the night, what I have them do is actually just go to bed a little later. And once they start falling asleep better because they're sleepy, then we start fading it earlier and earlier over time. So anxiety can be one other thing. So sometimes you might, if you feel that there's a lot of anxiety issues going on, it is something you might want to talk with your doctor about or see a clinical psychologist who's a child who specializes in children, because sometimes some of these fears in the dark or just anxiety about being away from the parent, it needs to be addressed. If you see that there's a lot of anxiety during the day and you're struggling with nighttime stuff, sometimes you have to address the anxiety during the day as well. So sometimes if they have fear of being alone in the dark, we'll just start with like go in the bedroom for 30 seconds by yourself. And if they can do it by themselves for 30 seconds, then you move up to a minute and so on and so forth. Make the bedroom fun. Bring in flashlights, put in some sleeping bags in there and just like play around for a while. Hide fun things in the closet and drawers, make a scavenger hunt out of it. There's a lot of things you can do to just make it less scary to be in the dark. And then coping strategies are really helpful. So deep breathing, there's a lot of great meditation out there. You can do apps during the day, but I don't love kids sitting with phones in the middle of the night trying to use a meditation to fall asleep to, because that just is not good in the long run. And positive self-talk. And then I do a lot of reward for coping behavior. So if a child's using some good strategies that you've taught, reward the heck out of it. Worry time is another thing that you can do. So worry time is where if you have a child who's very anxious, but again, sometimes you want to work with a clinical psychologist who specializes in kids, more on this stuff. But worry time is really where you set aside 20, 30 minutes a day and you can worry with the child. They can worry themselves on a piece of paper. You're allowing them to worry. But then, and you address it in that moment. But then if they're thinking about worries or they're talking about their worries later, you say, nope, not now, during worry time. Nope, not now, during worry time. So you're giving worry a place, but you're not giving it a place 24/7. And that's a really, really, really helpful strategy for some kids who tend to just really worry all the time, unproductively, especially. So nightmares can be treated a lot of times in many kids and adults. So one of the treatments that we do is something called dream restructuring. It's also known as imagery rehearsal therapy. You can look that up online. There's a lot of it's a very fast treatment. It's really about changing the imagery of the dream or the nightmare so that it's pleasant or neutral, so it's not scary anymore. And then I teach them how to rescript it in their brain and practice the rescripting over and over again, so it's not scary anymore. And eventually the nightmares do get better. It gives them a sense of control over the nightmares, and it works really well for all different age ranges. Dream catchers are another way that we do it. A lot of times you put a dream catcher in the room for younger kids. Sometimes that works. And if they're really scared of monsters, I make monster spray. So you can find out how to do that online too. So monster spray, you can make whatever potion you want, write monster spray on it, and it works really well for some kids. With spray in the room, I put lavender and I sprayed it in my daughter's bedroom every night for a week or two, and guess what? It makes the monsters are allergic to it and they don't want to use it anymore, and it works really well. So in the last bit of time we have, we're going to talk about adolescents and night owls and night owl syndrome. So circadian issues are normal. I mean, circadian delays are normal in adolescents to go to bed later, shift, want to go to bed later, sleep later. That's why right before the pandemic, I was giving a lot of talks. I was being asked to give talks at school boards and school districts because in support of pushing the start time for high school later, because it went against what their biological rhythm should be doing. But then the pandemic happened and a lot of kids weren't having to get up super early for school. So it'll be interesting to see how it all shakes out in the end. But how do you know when it's a normal delay versus it's become problematic? So when it's really the disorder, means it's causing a problem with their functioning. That's when the D is added on the end. So not just a delayed sleep phase, but a delayed sleep phase disorder. That's when they start having 3 to 5 hours to fall asleep a lot of time. And they're really struggling with getting up in the morning. Like they just often really, it's a lot of effort to get them up, or they get up and they're like in a complete daze and are extremely sleep deprived. So the sleep is of normal length and quality, but the delayed sleep issue causes psychosocial and psychological issues. So essentially, they're falling asleep 1, 2, 3, 4 in the morning and want to sleep naturally until 12 or 1 in the afternoon. But it looks like insomnia because they're getting up at 6 or 7 for school. So it looks like they're getting 2 hours for sleep. But if you just let them be for a school break for 2 weeks, they'll sleep 4 a.m. to noon every day, no problem. It's a normal length. The quality's fine. They don't have big blips in the middle of the night where they're awake. And that's all good, but it doesn't jive with the school schedule that they need. And that's the bigger problem. So, like I said, it's thought of as insomnia, but it's not. So don't, if that's really the issue, they're sleeping total normal amounts of time when they have a good break and you can chart it, it's not insomnia, and it does not require typical sleep medication like I have at the bottom. So I see kids who are put on these prescription medications that it's not fixing the problem. It's a Band-Aid and it doesn't really work. It's almost like if you were to give me, who goes to bed pretty early, but you were to give me like 4 p.m., you were to give me some Ambien, right? It's not really going to necessarily be great. I'm going to be in a daze, but I'm not necessarily going to fall asleep at 4 p.m. Basic sleep hygiene alone doesn't really work with this population. So consistency, avoiding caffeine, they're in like a permanent state of jet lag. And then high doses, we're going to talk about this, high doses of melatonin don't really work. So I see kids coming to me sometimes on 20, 30 milligrams of melatonin. Not good. So it is helpful to see a sleep specialist if you can regarding this issue, because a lot of it is very dependent on the time they fall asleep naturally and wake up naturally. So a lot of the recommendations I would give are very personalized to their sleep schedule. But bright light boxes can be really helpful, although some, if their delay is so bad, I'm not going to say get in front of a light box at 6 in the morning, because that actually make it worse. So you want to be careful with that, but bright light therapy, or even not even a bright light box, they can use the sun, right? Sit outside and just open the shades, even if it's not the brightest of day. that can be helpful, but you might want to seek help from a sleep specialist just to make sure the timing of it is appropriate. Um, no sleeping in. That's a hard one, especially if they're so sleep deprived. But when they sleep in on the weekends, you're setting the whole cycle over again. So if there's, I always say 2 hours max on the weekends. That's the latest I'll let them sleep in. So if they're sleeping in more than that until like noon or 1 on a weekend, good luck going to bed at 10 p.m. the next night. You are not going to build up enough hunger for sleep that it's going to be a real struggle. Another treatment option has been called chronotherapy. So it's easier to stay up later than it is to force yourself to go to bed earlier if you're a night owl. So this is a treatment where we'll have patients stay up later, 3 hours every day, believe it or not. But you have to really make sure there are no things that could be interruptions in the middle of the day, because they're going to be eventually sleeping 9 a.m. until 5 p.m. It just, that's when the schedule will go around. But eventually they'll come back around, and then you get them fixed on that. And for some, this is not anything I want anyone just going and trying at home, but if they're really, really delayed, sometimes I'll have kids stay up all night, not nap the next day, and sometimes it can fix the routine. But that's something you want to really seek the help from a specialist before you do that. Now, melatonin. A lot of thoughts on melatonin. So more is sometimes just more. It's not always better. So melatonin, believe it or not, but tiny doses in this age range, or actually any age range, even adults, I do it all the time with adults, tiny doses, 0.5 milligram. Good luck finding 0.5 milligram. It's not easy to find. It's just as effective as 3 milligrams for advancing your bedtime. So what we tend to do, what I tend to do, is once I've established a not normal, but a routine bedtime that's your adolescent, let's say they're normally falling asleep at 3 in the morning, I'm going to then count back 4 to 6 hours and give them a tiny dose of melatonin. But that tiny dose is not meant to make them fall asleep 4 to 6 hours earlier. It just basically makes the brain start wanting to produce melatonin a little earlier over time. It's all you're priming the system a little bit, saying, hey, come out a little bit earlier. So you're helping to enhance your brain's natural melatonin production, and over time you'll start going to bed earlier and earlier. But the things to think about with melatonin, it should not be the first line treatment for people overall. People take it like candy for everything. But the problem is we don't really have very good longer term studies on it, especially in kids and adolescents. We just don't. And with insomnia, it really should not be the first line treatment. There should be the behavioral things that I was talking about, working with a specialist if you can, but really try to put in some of the behavioral work, because sometimes that has to be done. Melatonin is just too quick of a fix for some. I'm not saying it's appropriate for people who've tried this stuff, but sometimes it shouldn't be the first line treatment for most kids. But in delayed sleep phase, we do use it. And I'll use it if really the other strategies like therapy, chronotherapy just aren't really ideal or indicated. So always talk to your pediatrician first. Some pediatricians are okay with melatonin, some are a little more hesitant. You just have to be careful. The other thing, we do have data on it in kids with autism and ADHD, and it works very well. So in those populations, I do use it frequently. But it's not always my first line treatment. I don't want to medicate every single sleep problem if I don't have to at the beginning. And then melatonin, the other thing to keep in mind, is not regulated by the FDA in the US. So there are some countries where it's a pharmaceutical. You have to get a prescription for it. Here, it's treated like an appetite supplement. So there have been studies done on some some melatonin bottles that say it has 3 milligrams of melatonin, and they'll have different dosages in all the pills because there's no governing body. So something to look for is ISP. I'm of course blanking on the name. It's not coming to my head. But you want to make sure it's got some sort of a regulation body that's looked over it, and I'll say like it has been looked at by this governing body, essentially, because the FDA won't look at it. So you want to make sure it has some stamp of approval essentially on it that shows that there was an external group that looked at that's essentially looking at the dosages and the bottles and what's coming in it. That's the ideal way to do it. But as I said, behavioral interventions really should be tried first, even though they are more difficult for many. But melatonin works very well for the phase shifting in adolescents. You just have to do it. I would do it with the advice of a sleep specialist if possible. And then finally, what are some more resources to help get your kids more sleep? So for kids, sleep problems in children with autism spectrum disorders, for a guide for frazzled families Katz and Mallow. Beth Mallow is one of the leading experts. She's a sleep specialist and works with kids and is a leading researcher on autism in sleep. I love her work, so it's a great book. Um, Sleep Better. I use the What to Do When You Dread Your Bed. I use that book a lot with like 8, 9, 10-year-olds. It's great. And then my colleague Colleen Carney came out with Good Night Mind for Teens, which is a bunch of ways to like kind of quiet your brain before bed if you have an active brain or a lot of worry. It's a really good book. And then for the parents, just a plug of my own, I had a book that came out in 2019, The Women's Guide to Overcoming Insomnia, Get a Good Night's Sleep Without Relying on Medication. So I highly recommend you look at that. You can get that on Amazon, all over the place. And then finally, Quiet Your Mind and Get to Sleep. So Colleen Carney, the Quiet Your Mind and Get to Sleep, the Good Night Mind for Teens is kind of like a little bit of a teenage version of it. So it's a really effective book. And then finally, I'll leave it here with Make Sleep a Priority. So I will take any questions and we'll go from there.
Oh my God, that was fantastic.
Thanks.
And I learned a ton. And we've got a bunch of questions. If it's okay, I'll start with a few questions that we had sent in prior to your talk. One of which is, what will support a teenage girl or a teenager to maintain a 10:30 bedtime? And how do you help a teen maintain consistency? You know, we're not exactly in control with, I mean, we're parents, but it's not the same as obviously a toddler or preschooler. They're individuating and, you know, making their own schedules. So how would you suggest supporting your teen in some of this consistency to enhance their sleep?
You know, I would have the conversation just like I have the conversation about just general health, right? Diet and exercise. We're always talking about how to eat well, how to just move your body and to do it in a non-shaming kind of way, right? All that sort of stuff. But I would do the same thing with sleep, right? Sleep is something that is an essential need for our bodies. And if we don't sleep, our brains won't. And sometimes kids actually really respond. It's interesting. If you have a child who's really motivated in school, but still gets sucked into all the like teenage stuff, sometimes like just having a discussion of, you know what, getting a good night's sleep is going to help you better in school. It's going to help you better socially. It's going to help you better with your mood. You will not, your studying will make so much, it will crystallize better if you don't cram at night and stay up all night. You'll do better if you sleep. And sometimes I've had discussions of just like car accident rates and all that sort of stuff because of drowsy driving that happens with teens. And that can sometimes be enough. But then the other thing is like, if they're, you know, we all get very addicted to our cell phones and our smartphones and everything. But sometimes you just have to take it away and then let them try and figure it out themselves. What can I, they kind of get bored after a while and then we'll start to make it a priority too.
Absolutely. Sort of natural sort of consequences. Um, Now I'm going to jump down to, we have someone who, her 4-year-old son wakes up every night and comes into her room. He wants to cuddle. He won't go back on his own. So they take him back and put him back to sleep. She's tried everything to break the habit outside of locking his door. Suggestions?
So yeah, the locking the door, I don't love that one because it makes a negative association for the room, which tends to be problematic long down the road. I would try, honestly, I would try the bedtime pass. It's old enough to understand if I have this pass next to me and I don't wake up, or I wake up but I don't get my mom, I will get a prize next morning. I'm a big fan of rewards because they do work a lot in some of these kids. So, and I would also make sure if they need you at the begin or in the middle of the night, make sure that they can fall asleep independently at the beginning of the night. So if your child still needs you to be like rubbing your back or singing to fall asleep to you there, then it's going to continue for the middle of the night stuff. So make sure you work on the beginning of the night if that's at all an issue. And if it's not, then maybe try the bedtime pass. That might be a nice, thing to try out.
And along the lines of the pass, someone had asked, how can I use the pass idea with a 12-year-old?
Same way. I mean, it could just be, I mean, it's with the 12-year-old, it's like, if you're coming in, if you don't come and get me, what do you want in the morning? But then the key is like, then you have to start stretching out the rewards, right? Every day. Look at everything, right? Then it's like, okay, you're doing great. We're going to up the ante. Okay, now you got to wait a week. If you do it for a week, then you get a bigger prize. And then slowly it just extinguishes itself. But it's the same exact idea. You just don't need to use as much glitter.
Gotcha. That makes sense.
Yeah.
I'm kind of jumping. I'm trying to get all the age groups. So,
Right.
if my teenager is not demonstrating any of the negative effects of sleep deprivation, is it still bad that he gets only 7 hours of sleep during the week and makes up for it over the weekend?
I mean, it's not ideal. It's better to try and be as routine as possible. It is. I mean, the other reality is like whatever their we always think about sleep debt, right? So it's if you're not getting enough sleep in the week, you're trying to make it up on the weekend. But if you're someone who, let's say it's a teen who's getting 7 hours and needs nine, that's 5 nights a week that they're missing out on sleep. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. 10 hours of sleep is lost. Good luck making up 10 hours on the weekend.
Okay. So, I mean, so are you, I mean, she's saying she hasn't seen any evidence of sleep deprivation, but obviously it's there if your
There.
teen has to make it up on the back end.
Exactly.
Okay. Um,
If you're a good sleeper, you should normally go to bed around the same time and wake up around the same time. So, it's
yeah,
seven. I will say those 7 hours is better than some teens. So it's
yeah.
not like
So she's doing okay.
it's
What could be better?
it could be better, but that's still like more normal that most teens are doing. But that's why we're fighting for later school start times for all.
Yep.
It's the ones who are like 4 hours because they really can't fall asleep that are really the big problem. Don't stress too much about it, but it should be more.
Yeah, sure. Um, this is a question that's come in a few times is how long before bed should kids stop screen time?
Oh, good question. Ideally an hour. So, I mean, some people say 2 hours, and good luck with that. But ideally an hour. So you let your brain really decompress.
Okay. Okay. That's kind of, I sort of answered someone on the side, but I said, this is what I know of as the rule of thumb, but let's, just get confirmation.
And if an hour is too much, start with a half hour, and then slowly, when you can make a half hour, then move it 35 minutes, and then you work your way there.
I think that's great. I love how you talk about like making baby steps instead of, taking everything away and starting over. You're kind of saying, okay, let's dial it back a little bit and then a little bit more and make it sort of a gradual process instead of yanking.
It's all behavior change. It's all behavior change. If someone wants to start an exercise plan, good luck with like 7 days a week of an hour every day. Start
Right.
with maybe once or twice a week for 20 minutes. If you get good at that, then build in something else. You'll have more success in the long run.
I totally get that. I totally get that. This is so helpful. She says, I'm struggling to find the right bedtime for my 9-year-old. He seems to take 30 to 45 minutes to fall asleep each night. Moving the bedtime slightly earlier or later doesn't seem to change that much. How do you advise identifying the optimal time for bedtime by age? Wow, that's tough.
That's a tough one to answer specifically here. It's often, I'd have to look at, honestly, I do sleep diaries. So I would track their sleep on the diary. It's
Mhm.
hard because you don't want to like stare at them and be like,
Yeah,
how long? But try to track it because there might be a little bit more pattern than you recognize.
right.
If you can get it, I have a sleep diary on my website. If you want to download that one, there's a billion versions. But that might be the first thing, and then you can start to like move it a little bit later. But within half hour is still totally fine. It really depends upon what the wake time is. So
Gotcha.
people often say, "What's the ideal bedtime?" It's like, well, what time are they waking up in the morning? And that's kind of what you have to think about.
That's right. There's another mom who asks her 6-year-old falls asleep, has trouble falling asleep, so falls asleep to audiobooks. Is
Mhm.
that okay?
I don't love it. I know a lot of people do that. The problem is that A, there's tech in the room, right? And
Yeah.
then B, what happens is, and I do this with adults all the time, people will use like the meditations to fall asleep to, is that once you wake up, you need that again because you've essentially trained yourself to need it to fall back asleep to again.
Okay.
So, and it's just, if you can try to get rid of it because there's just too much of a temptation. So
Sure.
when you wake
Right.
up, phone there, and then it's a rabbit hole.
Gotcha. Um, my 10-year-old has RSL and sleepwalks. This started about 2 years ago. Is it something that you will most likely outgrow?
RLS,
Mhm.
the restless leg. I don't know if you necessarily outgrow it in kids. I don't know so much about that aspect. I would, if it's something that you're, sometimes the sleepwalking, they often do outgrow it,
Okay,
totally.
they do.
But the restless legs, like I don't sleepwalk anymore, thank goodness. But
Yeah.
if restless legs is keeping your child up with
Uh-huh.
insomnia, they're going to be sleep deprived, which might prolong the sleepwalking, if that makes sense.
Gotcha. Because the sleep deprivation enhances the,
all that stuff. You got it.
looks like a bad cycle.
Yeah.
Ooh. We've got a lot of questions, so I'm trying to get when reestablishing a good sleep behavior, how many days should it take and how many days should you give it before going on to wonder if you have the delayed sleep disorder you mentioned?
Oh, the best way to really determine it is if you have like a good week off from school or 2 weeks. Like you can pretty much start to tell like, oh, when school, like if you have the 2 week break this coming up soon, great. Give it like the first maybe 4 or 5 days because they're going to be sleep deprived and that's going to be showing. But
Sure.
then after 4 or 5 days, you can kind of see what they're doing. And then if you think back, like, what do they do on all this summer breaks? Like after camp is done, are they always sleeping really late? There's probably a bit of that there.
There's
Yeah.
um uh we have a mom of a 2-year-old who started climbing out of the crib 2 weeks ago. She's safe and thinks it's funny. I kind of remember those days. She won't wear a sleep sack. Should I keep her in it or make a toddler bed?
Um, General rule is try to keep them in the crib as long as possible.
Okay.
It is, it will make your life a lot easier. So
Okay.
I know another pediatric sleep doctor, Craig Ken Perry, just said the exact same thing online. He was like 3.5, 4. I mean, 4, a lot of kids are like outgrowing the crib. Well, my
Right.
kids were in the crib until 3.5. And because at 2, they don't have the
Right.
knowledge that there's invisible gates there essentially, that they can't leave.
Yep.
So it will make it much more difficult. If they won't wear a sleep sack, it depends on what kind of crib you have too. If you have one of those cribs that's higher in the back and lower in the front, like more like the sleigh kind of looking cribs,
Right.
turn it around. So the
Ah,
rent is higher.
okay. So
So
more difficult to, okay.
yeah, if it becomes a real safety issue routinely, I mean, have a talk. People freak out after the first time. Don't
Yep.
have a talk with the kid. But you try to do whatever you can to try to avoid moving to the bed as best you can, or the toddler bed.
Gotcha. Um, this is a question we got before. My oldest is 16 years old. I'm worried about him because he spends so much time on the computer, in his room by himself, talking to people he hasn't even met, being up so late and into the morning. It's very concerning, um, because he's not getting enough sleep, and he gets angry if I tell him I'm going to take the phone away, but it's for his own health. What should I do?
That's where it's much more of an issue of you've got to set firm limits and deal with the behavior that's the behavior burst that's going to happen from it. But eventually, hopefully, it will sink in and set that firm limit. Sometimes I haven't done it so much because I don't have teens in my house, but
Yeah,
some Wi-Fi's will have like a time that you can set where it will go off. So
right.
that's another option to try that. So you can turn
Okay.
off all the internet in your house too by a certain time.
Yeah, we do that in our house. Everything shuts down at a certain time, so it's not kind of an option. Because it
Create
is
the
hard.
temptation.
I call it the tech tug of war. It's really hard to engage in the tech tug of war, when you don't have to do that because it's just shut down. It sort of alleviates that.
Exactly.
What are your thoughts on blackout shades? Helpful to black out light at night, but does it disrupt the opportunity for gradual light input in the morning?
I love blackout shades. So
Okay,
I love them. I'm a huge fan. It's when the morning comes, you just literally should just open the shades because the problem is the sun comes out at such varying times, right? Like for me,
right,
it's very sensitive. So for adults, 5:30, I'm like, oh, I don't want that in the summer.
right.
But it's helpful. There are though, if you feel like your teen would benefit from a gradual light coming on, there are dawn simulator lights that you can get too. So Hatch makes one that's a great alarm clock. They're really pretty too. I have a few of them.
Yeah.
It
Dawn simulated one?
will slowly come on. You can set it for different types of light. My 10-year-old, 11-year-old, I gotta used to saying that. He'll sit there and he'll like listen to the relaxing music before bed and it'll have like a wind down routine on it. And same
Oh,
thing for the morning. You customize it for like 20 minutes, 5 minutes before the sun will come on and it'll play like meditative music, all this stuff.
oh, okay.
So it's another option.
Okay, that's awesome. I like that dawn simulator light.
It's different from like a bright light therapy. That's what we do when we have
Right.
really extremely delayed sleep phase kids.
Gotcha. We have a mom who says her first grader sleeps with a nightlight in her room. How can I transition her to not having that nightlight on?
Is it a problem?
Yeah, I was kind of wondering if it's, if, oh, wait, I submitted the question but didn't realize that my name would appear.
Oh, different.
Oh, I don't know. Same person. Is it a problem? Is the question. If you want to chat, um, if you want to put it in the chat, I'll ask it again. But
A nightlight is fine. I mean, we always talk
right,
about like a dark room, a cave.
right,
The light, yes, thought the light was bad. So light's not ideal, but if they're sleeping fine with it, I mean, like I have some older adults that have like balance issues, and I'm like, put a nightlight in your bathroom, put a nightlight. It's okay to have a
right.
nightlight. It's
Yep,
just you find that they're waking up in the middle of the night, you know.
right. Okay. I mean, I think, let's see. Oh, there's one question about do you relate mouth breathing in cases to poor sleep?
So mouth breathing, if that's happening a lot at night, it can suggest that there is some sort of quality of, I mean, in some kids who have like apnea, they're
Yep.
mouth breathers. So it's something if you want to have looked at, it can,
Okay.
if you think there's snoring or anything else like that going on, allergies, all that stuff can influence sleep quality. So it might not hurt to talk to an ENT or a sleep specialist.
Okay. We'll take two more, if that's okay. Um, I have a 6-year-old with ADHD who has a hard time settling down at night before bedtime. Very wired and sometimes anxious. Melatonin works well, but trying other ideas to
What
help.
was that? You broke up. What?
Um, has a hard time settling down at night before bedtime, very wired and sometimes anxious. Melatonin works well, but trying to find other ideas to help.
Yeah, that's one of the age rate the groups where melatonin has been a little bit researched. It winding down. I mean, I guess it's a question of like, what does the wind down routine look like?
Right.
Um, and also the timing, right? Is the timing appropriate? Are they going to bed too early? Do we stay up a little bit later? I'm a huge fan of mindfulness and meditation practice. So I teach it to kids to do it during the day, and then I have them practice at night. Because if they're learning the skill at night when they're already wound up, not ideal. But you want to learn it during the day and then try to practice what you've already learned, use it at night a little bit more. So meditation is very helpful.
Okay. And one final question. How long generally should it take a teen to fall asleep? 30 minutes? Does the suggested time in your age related sleep time chart only include the sleep time itself, excluding the time it takes to fall asleep?
Oh, that's splitting hairs a little bit. It's because it varies. I think within a half hour is just considered normal limits, but it's also hard. Like you're not standing over your teen, like you fell
Right,
asleep.
right.
So it's real. A lot of this is like, are you bothered by it? Right. So insomnia, I don't diagnose someone if they're 32 minutes to fall asleep versus 30. It's, are you bothered by it? If you're bothered by it, then we've got an issue and we have to address it.
Right. Gotcha. All good. Well, thank you so much. There's such a wealth of wonderful information,
My
and
pleasure.
everyone's chatting that they got so much out of this. And thank you so much. It was really very informative, and
My
we
pleasure.
appreciate you being with us. And can you just can you put up your on the screen your contact the initial slide that you had? Just wanted to make sure.
Here we go. Can I share again? It's not, oh, share with screen. Yeah.
Just so people have your
Hold on one second. Let me close that. Let me get to it. Just take
okay, perfect. So just wanted to make sure that got out there again. Thank you so much. And also the recording will be posted on Heard and Rhyme. So thank you for joining us, and thank you, Dr. Harris. Appreciate your
Thank
time.
you for having me. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.